My grandmother lay in a freezing ICU room, struggling through the final moments of her life when I frantically sent a message to my parents, pleading with them to come. A short while later, my phone vibrated with my father's response. "We'll come if she really passes away. You're already there, and you'll take better care of her than we would." They chose a lavish cruise vacation instead of being present during her final hours, but Grandma heard the notification sound. Before taking her last breath, she understood everything. Rather than leaving behind a conventional will, she placed a flash drive in my hand and instructed me to play it only after the entire family had gathered. Stay with my story until the very end, and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from so I can see how far my grandmother's final words have traveled. Because 1 week later, during her funeral, my parents arrived with rehearsed tears and expectations of inheriting everything. Their smiles remained until the moment I pressed play. My name is Maya, and at 35 years old, I have finally accepted that sharing blood does not automatically mean receiving unconditional love. Throughout my life, I lived between two entirely different realities. On one side stood my parents, John and Eleanor, two profoundly self-centered narcissists who measured other people only by what benefits they could extract from them. On the other side was my grandmother, the kind and loving woman who essentially raised me, protected me from their emotional indifference, and showed me the true meaning of genuine affection. A few days ago, that delicate balance was destroyed forever. Grandma suffered a sudden and serious medical crisis and was rushed into emergency surgery. I remained alone in the cold, sterile waiting area, my heart racing while every passing minute felt like an eternity. When the surgeon finally walked out, one look at his face made my stomach sink. With sincere compassion, he informed me that her condition was critical. She only had a few hours remaining, and I needed to notify the family immediately. My hands shook as I reached for my phone and called my father. The call went straight to voicemail. In desperation, I sent a message to both of my parents, begging them to come to the hospital before it became too late. I sat there staring at the screen until it eventually lit up. The reply came from my father, John. I read his words and felt completely numb with disbelief. He wrote, "You're already there. You'll take better care of her. We'll come if she actually dies." The cruelty of those words blurred before my eyes as tears began to form. I locked my phone, swallowed the overwhelming bitterness of betrayal, and returned to Grandma's room. She looked incredibly fragile beneath the harsh hospital lights, surrounded by machines that monitored the little strength she had left. Sitting beside her, I gently held her thin, wrinkled hand in mine. To my astonishment, her eyes slowly opened. Although medication weighed heavily on her body, her mind remained perfectly clear, and her gaze carried a deep, quiet awareness. She glanced around the empty room before focusing on me once more. "Is John coming, sweetheart?" she whispered so softly that I could barely hear her. My throat tightened. In that instant, I felt more anger toward my parents than I had ever imagined possible. I could not bring myself to deceive her, not at a time like this. With my heart breaking, I gestured toward my phone and told her exactly what my father had written. I expected tears, but none came. Instead, a sorrowful yet understanding smile appeared on her face. She was not surprised in the slightest. "Maya, listen carefully," she murmured, squeezing my hand with a strength that caught me off guard. "They believe their cruelty goes unseen, but someone always bears witness. I want to leave one final testimony, and I need your help." Weakly, she motioned toward my phone. She asked me to place it on the bedside table, pointing directly at her, and start recording. My hands trembled as I prepared the camera, fully realizing the importance of what she intended to do. I pressed the record button and Grandma fixed her eyes on the lens. With complete clarity and unwavering composure, she began revealing the truth about everything. Later that evening, she passed away peacefully, with only my hand in hers. A week went by, and the day of her funeral finally arrived. The chapel was crowded with distant family members, neighbors, and lifelong friends. However, the true spectacle began the moment John and Eleanor made their dramatic appearance. I sat quietly in the front row, watching with disgust as my parents walked down the aisle, dressed in extravagant black clothing that seemed designed more for attention than mourning. Eleanor clutched an enormous lace handkerchief, repeatedly dabbing at eyes that held no tears, while John carried himself with an exaggerated stoop, releasing deep, theatrical sighs loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. To the rest of the congregation, they appeared to be a shattered couple, grieving the heartbreaking loss of a cherished mother. They welcomed every ounce of artificial sympathy, whispering to crying relatives about how utterly devastated they were by Grandma's death. The sheer hypocrisy turned my stomach, yet I kept my composure and remained silent, knowing my time would come. Once the first viewing ended, people slowly made their way toward the chapel garden for a short break. John immediately seized the opportunity, slipping away from the crowd and trapping me in an empty hallway. He never asked how I was coping, nor did he offer even the smallest gesture of comfort. Instead, his eyes shifted nervously from side to side before he leaned closer, every trace of his fake sorrow suddenly gone. "Maya," he whispered sharply, his voice now demanding rather than mournful, "we need to talk about the estate. Your mother and I have to review the deeds to the house and Grandma's bank accounts before the official reading. Naturally, as her direct blood relatives, I assume the main inheritance belongs to us. Where are the documents?" He stood there fully expecting me to surrender everything she had built throughout her entire life. Before I could respond to his entitled demand, the heavy bells of the chapel rang out, signaling that everyone needed to return to their seats. I simply met John's gaze, offered him a cold, emotionless smile, and walked away without saying a single word. He muttered something under his breath, but he had no choice except to follow me back into the main hall to preserve the image he had worked so hard to create. The mood inside the chapel grew increasingly solemn as everyone settled once again into the wooden pews. Just as the service seemed to be approaching its natural conclusion and the funeral director prepared to guide the pallbearers, our local pastor stepped forward to the pulpit. Yet he was not carrying his usual Bible. Instead, he held a thick envelope sealed with official markings. He looked directly toward our row, his expression unusually severe. After adjusting the microphone, he announced that Grandma had entrusted the envelope to her attorney only days before her emergency surgery, with explicit instructions that its contents be read aloud before her burial. A curious silence swept through the room. The pastor carefully broke the seal, unfolded a crisp sheet of paper, and began reading Grandma's final message. His voice resonated through the chapel. "To everyone gathered here, thank you for honoring my memory. But before I leave this world, there is a truth that must be spoken." He paused for a long moment, inhaled deeply, and then continued with the next sentence exactly as it had been written. "If my son John is present in this room, do not allow him to pretend to be a grieving son. He surrendered that privilege long ago." A wave of shocked gasps spread throughout the chapel. John's carefully practiced posture disappeared in an instant as every bit of color drained from his face, leaving him pale and frozen. The silence that followed felt unbearable while the pastor allowed Grandma's devastating words to settle into the hearts and minds of everyone present. John remained stiff in his seat, clutching the wooden armrests with such force that his knuckles had gone completely pale. Meanwhile, Eleanor darted anxious glances around the chapel, slowly realizing that the perfect image they had spent years cultivating was collapsing before everyone's eyes. Yet the true devastation had only just begun. The pastor lifted his gaze from the sheet in his hands and motioned toward the large projection screens mounted along the chapel walls. "In accordance with the deceased's final and explicit wishes," he said in a calm voice, "we will now play the video message she personally recorded." I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and tapped the screen to stream the recording Grandma and I had made during that lonely final night in the hospital. Within seconds, her face appeared on every screen. She looked painfully weak, but her eyes still carried a powerful determination and clarity that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Hello, everyone." Her voice rang clearly through the chapel speakers. "If you are watching this, then it means I have passed away. I wanted to use this final opportunity to speak about my son, John." She stared directly into the camera as though she could see straight through him. 1 week ago, while I was lying in a hospital bed waiting to die, my granddaughter, Maya, begged my son to come and say goodbye. His answer was a text message saying that he would only come if I had actually died. A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the extended family. Still, Grandma was not finished. On the screen, she raised a printed copy of the text conversation, revealing his exact words for every person in attendance to witness. With remarkable composure, she recounted years of hidden selfishness and emotional abandonment, permanently tearing away the image he had built around himself. The recording continued smoothly as Grandma delivered her final legal declarations, her voice unwavering and resolute. Because of this, she said, I have spent my remaining days revising my entire estate plan with my trusted attorney. To my granddaughter, Maya, who stayed by my side when everyone else walked away, I leave my house, my savings, and everything that represents my legacy. A quiet wave of approval moved through the congregation. Yet Grandma still had one final lesson reserved for the two people who had abandoned her. To my son, John, and his wife, Eleanor, I leave my commercial building downtown. John's eyes lit up with sudden hope, believing that he had finally inherited something valuable. However, Grandma's expression on the screen turned cold and unforgiving. What they do not realize, she continued, is that this property is burdened with the maximum possible mortgage debt, owes more than $300,000 in unpaid taxes, and is facing severe structural violation penalties. I leave them every legal obligation attached to those debts. They wish to inherit my life, so they can also inherit my burdens. The screen slowly faded into darkness, leaving the entire chapel in stunned silence. John and Eleanor sat motionless as reality finally settled in. They were not receiving wealth or prosperity. Instead, they had inherited a crushing financial disaster accompanied by complete public humiliation. Family members turned in their seats, whispering among themselves while casting looks of absolute disgust in their direction. Understanding that their carefully protected reputation had been destroyed and that their greed had ultimately ruined them, John seized Eleanor's arm. The two of them rose from their seats and hurried down the aisle, disappearing into the afternoon sunlight before the funeral service had even come to an end. 3 months have passed since that unforgettable day, and my entire life has changed. I moved into Grandma's beautiful home, preserving her memory and permanently cutting John and Eleanor out of my life. With their public image shattered, my parents had no choice but to sell their expensive possessions simply to cover the overwhelming taxes and mortgage liabilities attached to the cursed commercial property Grandma had left behind. In the end, their own greed became the instrument of their downfall. Grandma's final recording did more than protect the legacy she had worked so hard to build. It granted me freedom from years of emotional control and manipulation. Now, I want to ask all of you listening to my story something important. How would you have responded if your own parents had sent such a heartless message during a family emergency? Would you have shown everyone the video? Share your opinions below, and let's continue this conversation.